Hello, students. This is Chapter 2, Ethical Considerations in the Practice of Research, from the book Counseling Research. So let's get started. When we talk about research, we need to also have a conversation about ethics. And ethics and research is derived from the same place that ethics are derived from whenever we're talking about treatment. And usually that is from the ACA Ethical Code. It could also be state rules, either administrative rules or revised code in our state. So the ACA ethical guidelines basically say that we need to practice informed consent. We need to make sure that we're ensuring the best treatment for our client, that our clients can remain either anonymous or confidential, and if we are publishing anything as a result of our research or presenting anything, that we're not revealing client identities in our publications or our presentations. Now, ethical guidelines are really good to have, but they don't encase every possible scenario for every ethical dilemma that we might have. So they give us general guidelines, and hopefully they can sort of guide us they give us guidelines that we can apply in specific situations to help us with the decision-making process. So research ethics. Research ethics is the study of the science of doing right and wrong. And if you're faced with a dilemma between your values and your obligations, those two things are in conflict, then which is the right thing to do? Research integrity, it's defined as the commitment to intellectual honesty. In other words, even when nobody's looking, I've made a commitment to myself that I'm going to be honest and I'm going to do the right things. I'm going to go by the rules. So responsible conduct of research. That's defined as conducting research in a way that fulfills our professional responsibilities as a researcher. It also fulfills our responsibilities to the professional organizations such as the American Counseling Association and the institution or agency where we work. And sometimes that also means the government and the public if we're getting a grant or something like that. And of course, going by the rules of whatever state that we're in. So core areas for responsible conduct research: data acquisition, the way that we manage the data, the way that we share it, who owns it, what happens to it after the study's over. Those are all things that we have to make decisions around and be responsible for when it comes to research. And I think that unless you've done research, you don't really think, oh, how complicated can that be? And it always surprises me, things that can come up related to either acquiring the data and or storing and managing the data. A lot of times when we're conducting research, we also have mentors or trainees that we're working with. And one of the areas we're responsible for is managing those relationships in a way that's ethical. We also are responsible for the publication practices and making sure that if we're authoring something, we're giving credit where credit is due, and those types of issues. Peer review, if we're engaged in peer review, that we're accepting that feedback or that we're giving that feedback in a very honest way. Let's see, collaborative science, human subjects, you're going to learn a lot more about when it comes to the National Institute of Health, so I'm not going to go into that too much. Research involving animals, we don't do a whole lot of that as counselors. Research misconduct, this is one of the areas sort of that we try to police ourselves on because we don't want folks engaging in misconduct around research issues. And then, of course, We have to be responsible whenever there are areas of conflict around our interest and commitment. In other words, if I am paid as a consultant by Merck, I don't want to be doing research on medicines that Merck is developing because obviously there's a conflict of interest there. So if we're not responsible when it comes to our conduct around research, it can actually lead to harm for our clients or the human subjects that are participating, and we want to avoid that. So we need to become really familiar with what the ethical code says, and if there's other codes that apply in the area that we're engaging in our research. Researcher responsibilities. We have a responsibility to the subjects that participate in our research, and we have to consider the impact on them of this list of things. If we decide to investigate the impact of, I'm trying to think of a good one here. If we try to investigate the impact of being sexually assaulted as a female during your undergraduate years, potentially that could have a deep impact on the subjects of that research, because each person who would qualify to be a participant would have to have been a victim at some point. So we have to be very aware of, even though there might be great value in understanding the answer to that question, we also have to know that it's really going to impact the people that we're asking to be open with us. So as one of our considerations, we're going to have to figure out what that impact is, and then our IRB, or Institutional Review Board, is going to ask us how to minimize any risk to our subjects or how to make it right if we end up destabilizing emotionally a research subject because of the matter that we are researching. We have to consider the design of our study. So if we're looking at being sexually assaulted as an undergraduate, the design of that study, we could do survey questions, we could do face-to-face interview, we could do a combination of those things. And those are just a couple of examples. Some face-to-face might be better in that particular, asking about that particular research question, because someone is going to be physically present with that research subject, and it is a subject matter that has a potential for really upsetting the subjects that we're asking the questions of. So we might choose a methodology that gives us a little more contact with our subjects so that we can monitor how they're doing. We also need to really consider what kind of instrument we're using to collect the data. It could be a structured interview, it could be an assessment instrument that's out there, it could be, again, a combination. And then I already talked a little bit about the possible risks to our research subjects by participating in the research. And the general rule of thumb is that if we are asking people to put themselves in a situation where they're going to be any more at risk than they would be in the normal course of their life day to day, then we have to put something in place to reduce that risk and have a plan in case someone is harmed by that, how we're going to rectify it. So down at the bottom of this page, in really, really small print, you're going to see where it says IRB sample application form. And the first one here, the shorter link, is to the IRB application for Shawnee State. The second one, the longer link, is the IRB application for Lindsey Wilson College. So we're going to talk a little bit more about IRB later on. But if we're doing any kind of research, one of the things that we need to do is we need to propose that research to an institutional review board and give other folks a chance to look at that and see what it is that we're doing, and either put their stamp of approval on it or make sure that all of our ethical obligations are being met. So you can look at the forms and see there are commonalities between all forms across all IRBs, but that doesn't mean that they all look the same. Okay, so I've already talked about taking steps to minimize risk to human subject participants. We also have to be very vigilant about the data collection process, the way that we present informed consent information, because we can't present it in a way that is slanted or that withholds anything. We have to be very, very upfront with our human subject research participants, and they have to be given a very real ability to say yes or no with full knowledge of what it is they're being asked to do. Now, we'll talk a little bit about misrepresenting things in order to get an unbiased response. And there are times when an IRB will allow us to do that, but there's also certain precautions that we have to take at the end of the study to make sure that our human subjects knew that we deceived them in some way for the purposes of the research and getting an unbiased result. So there's a whole nother set of things that we have to do to make sure that we're being ethical if we are engaging in some type of deception. Okay, so we have a lot of responsibility around how we're analyzing the data and making sure that the way that we're analyzing it is accurate in giving us the best possible representation of the numbers. Our confidentiality procedures, how we're sharing the results, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. And then one of the things that is our responsibility is basically just this commitment to, throughout the process, making sure that our participants' rights are upheld. All right, so research ethics wasn't always really a thing. Ethics should have always been a thing, but the way that this got applied to research was that just really didn't. And it took some pretty horrific things and people getting hurt in order for ethics around research to evolve and become what they are today. So here are 4 studies that went completely off of the rails. You can read about this in your book, but you're also going to get some good information on it when you do the NIH certificate. So I'm not going to go into detail on this. Just know that the reason why we have the rules we have today is because a lot of people got hurt, and some of them got hurt very badly. All right, so the Belmont report was commissioned because of some of the really horrific things that were happening around abuse of human subject research participants. And so in the Belmont report, we came out with some standards. 2 of these are that a person who's participating in a research study has autonomy. They can basically decide that they are done participating at any time, and we can't coerce them into staying. And that if we're dealing with human subjects who have a diminished capacity, in other words, maybe they're children, they're prisoners, or inmates, or they're mentally retarded or developmentally disabled, then there are special protections for those individuals. The other thing was this idea of beneficence. And beneficence is basically that we're doing good. No matter what we're doing, it should be beneficial or doing some type of good and not harming other people. So when we say not harming, that's non-malfeasance, right? But the flip side of that is beneficence. We're going to do good, not evil with our power. All right. You should actually remember this word from your first class that was talking about ethics, because beneficence is one of those pillars of all counseling. But in this particular case, we're applying it to research. Justice. This should also look familiar to you. Justice basically just means that we're being fair. Who bears the burden of the risks and who receives the benefits of the research. That we're not taking advantage of other people for our own benefit. So this looks at participant safety. If we're interfering with somebody's life, we had better have a really, really, really good justification for why it is that we're doing that, and the benefits of doing that had better be really, really high. So we see that sometimes in medical research, because when companies are doing research on new drugs and we're giving individuals a new drug, that has the potential to interfere with their life. So in situations like that, there really has to be a great justification to outweigh the potential risks. All right, we also have to be just when it comes to our population and the sample that we're selecting, making sure that whoever agrees to participate is getting what they promised, or what they were promised. All right. So institutional review boards, and I mentioned this earlier when I mentioned on the slide that has the link to the institutional review board applications. So one of the things that also happened is that institutional review boards were created, and they are basically tasked with ensuring that human subjects are being respected, that they're being benefited, and they're being treated justly. So the IRB will weigh the risk versus the benefits, and they have the power to say you cannot do a research project, or you can do this research project, but you have to alter it in this way or that way in order to reduce risk. And I put in here, refer back to slide 8 in this chapter if you want to investigate those applications and see what all you're required to explain. Okay, so a few other research responsibilities. So we're really obligated to consider the process of a study or evaluation, including the relationships with our study participants. If we're collaborating with sponsors or other agencies, that is a special consideration. And then the confidentiality of our data and our data management, especially if it is a collaborative relationship, because if we have 2 or 3 agencies or institutions that are involved in a research project, who then owns the data once it's over? Who's responsible for managing that and protecting it? And then, of course, ethically reporting our research results. All right, so if we are doing a study and we are having a lot of contact with our research participants, ethical standards do exist that guide our relationship with them. And that relationship should be professional and should not veer into the non-professional. So I think it goes without saying that researchers should not sexually harass their research participants. However, knowing that this is it is spelled out in black and white in our ethical code that we're not to sexually harass research participants and or clients, by the way. What that means is that somebody somewhere at some point in time didn't know that, or if they did know that, they didn't do the right thing. So in my world, I think that this is common sense, that you shouldn't be doing this. But obviously somebody did. So it bears, I guess, repeating, do not sexually harass your research participants. All right, so if we were to have a non-professional interaction between ourselves and a participant, if it's unavoidable or it could be beneficial, very parallel to what we would consider with treatment between a clinician and a client, then we need to document the rationale for the interaction. And we need to do that, if at all possible, prior to engaging in the non-professional interaction. So if we are, if we end up at a wedding and we didn't know that our client was going to be there and they're seated at the same table that we are, we're still, you can't exactly ignore that person. You're going to have to engage in a social situation with them as minimally as possible. In that situation, it wouldn't be possible to document it ahead of time, but we would want to document it afterwards. If we knew about it ahead of time, we would want to have a conversation and we want to document the rationale for that. Okay, so if we have sponsors that we need to collaborate with, we really need to make sure that we know who's responsible for what and what the limitations are as far as the sponsor, what they're allowed to see, what they're not allowed to see. They need to be very aware of what our data collection procedures are. If we change anything about our methodology, and then at the end, what the results of the study were. We actually should have some type of report and meeting with our sponsors and go over what the report means. Let's see. All right, I talked about confidentiality and data management a little bit earlier, but specifically, one of the things that we have to do is we have to remove any and all identifying information. If we're using data from where we provided counseling services, we would be responsible for removing our clients' names, the dates. For me, we also have student ID numbers, so that would have to be removed. We would also remove, before it was published, enough of the information that no one could possibly identify based on this person being male or female, their program of study, their class rank, and then some specific issues. If a cluster of data being provided about an individual would possibly reveal that individual's identity, then we would have to remove some of that data so that no one could figure out who we were talking about. So before we even start a research project, we have to have a plan as to what's going to happen to the data and the documents once the research project is over. And we can plan to shred that. We can plan to keep it for a period of time. If we're doing a trend study, we might want to do that. But we have to have a plan as to how long it's going to be kept, where it's going to be kept, who's responsible for it, and then how it's going to end up being destroyed. Okay, so when we come to reporting our results, it's important to the counseling profession. It's important to counseling professionals and clients because it leads to, hopefully, it leads to more evidence-based practice and informs folks who are doing treatment as to better ways to do treatment. So ethical concerns related to our reporting our results are making sure that any published reports are accurate. We check, we double check, we triple check, we have somebody else check, we have them double check. We want to make absolutely certain before a research report is published, whether it's published formally or internally within our institution or agency. Those numbers are going to be out there for public consumption in black and white. we need to ensure that they are completely accurate. Sometimes folks want to report only those things that were found to be significant, and we don't want to do that. We want to report things that were found to be not significant as well. And one of the reasons that we do that is because finding something's not significant also increases our knowledge about what things are not related, and that's important information to have. We also want to avoid plagiarism, and we don't want to reproduce other people's ideas without citing them. All right, there's always multicultural competencies that need to be put in place if we're doing research, and these are just the counselor awareness of own cultural values and bias. That's one competency. The second competency is just awareness of our client's worldview. The third competency is using appropriate intervention strategies. And multicultural competencies are something that is also talked about in our ethical guidelines. So that brings us to the end of Chapter 2.